basement is actually a lot better than it sounds. So I will be discussing, as you see from the program, with more focus, something that we've touched on so far, obviously with the musical presentations, but also with what Mrs. LaRouche touched on this morning, which is the issue of culture and beauty and the necessity, if we are going to win the current political fight, of a global renaissance. And I'd just like to say that there's no way that we will win the current political fight, and there's no way that the projects that we've been discussing and the cooperation and the national agreements will take place and move forward for very long at all if we hold on to a depraved culture. The one cannot accompany the other. So we stand at a truly great moment of human freedom on a scale which has never been possible for mankind ever before in his history. So what I'd like to discuss, so what I'm going to get into, is the fact that beauty and culture and music are not the after effects of a great scientific revolution or a political revolution. They're not an accompaniment, an also-ran. They're not something which comes in the wake of having a great breakthrough in political freedom, but beautiful culture is actually the necessary driver of both politics and scientific discovery. But first, I'd point out something which all of you already know, which is that today's culture, increasingly since the assassination of Kennedy, is a depraved culture, globally. While you have pockets of things which are not depraved, which are very precious, as a whole, mankind has been reduced to the level of a beast. And his leisure time, his entertainment culture, that which gives him pleasure, has been designed to appeal to the most base instincts of man, the most basic physical sensations, the most basic senses of pleasure, which we share with animals. And a population in that condition cannot carry on a fight for political freedom. So obviously what we are discussing with the implementation of a new paradigm and the revival of the trajectory that mankind was on before the assassination of Kennedy and what happened during that decade is the creation of a new civilization, in a sense. And Mr. LaRouche has spent quite a bit of effort in the recent year publishing a series of writings addressing exactly the issue of what it is that makes mankind unique. What is it that we can call truly human? And something that he focuses on as the main core of that is the issue that mankind is not an animal. And what separates us from animals is that we have not just the ability, but it is our nature to go beyond, to have an experience and an existence which is beyond sense perception, beyond the here and now, beyond what can be known by the experience of the senses. And I just wanted to read a short passage from his newest document, which is called The Search for a Mislaid Truth. And he says, just at the very beginning of the writing, he says, "The old habits of sense perception are challenged by our species' toe-in-the-water gestures in the direction of a relatively nearby part of solar space. Now, just as Nicholas of Cusa had demanded an escape from the Atlantic boundaries of Europe to enter a new world whose reach had lain beyond the habitats of the old Europe-centered continent, it may now be said that nearby space is not to be contained by the habituated old fantasies of a human species, nor by fantasies whose rude view of life had been confined to Earth." And so in a very real way, Mr. LaRouche is calling on the human species now to escape the oligarchical grip of a culture which is dominated by an oligarchical system of sense perception. And we can do that by creating for ourselves a culture with a new kind of experience, which is an experience of the knowledge of the truth. And so what I'd like to offer is I'd like to offer thoughts from some of the greatest thinkers of the past on what that is. What is the experience? how does the experience of the truth occur to man? And so I want to start with this man that you see up on the screen here, Vladimir Vernadsky, who was a great Russian-Ukrainian biogeochemist and who had a tremendous lifelong career of building up a science of the history of the development of the organization of the planet Earth as it's been shaped by chemical, energetic, and life, and I'll tell you in a minute, human life processes. So Vernadsky studied the billions of years history of the Earth and the unique kinds of chemical and geological formations that have come about. And he studied life in this context. And he took the study of life out of the hands of the biologist, who would look at the living creature as it exists in the here and now, its form, its lifespan, other characteristics which distinguish that particular form of life as it exists in the here and now, and the search for life in that way. And Vernadsky said that the way we must study life is we must study what does life do. He recognized that life is not a fixed thing that exists at one moment of time. It's not a fixed thing, obviously, over evolutionary time, when we see the changeover of species to species to species. But it's also not a fixed thing in current time. You are not made up of the same materials that you were 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. Your body is composed of completely, there's nothing in your body that was there 10, 15, 20 years ago. You're a completely different piece of physical matter. And this is true of all living things. So what is permanent about the living organism? Well, what Vernadsky said is what's permanent is what he called the biogenic migration of atoms, which is that we look at the action of the living thing upon the environment around him. How it is that the living thing pulls materials from the surrounding environment into its body, transforms those materials, turning them into different kinds of chemical compounds that don't exist outside of life, even the possibility of transmutation, the kind of transmutation that wouldn't occur outside of life. And then the leaving of those chemicals, either by exhalation, excretion, or death, and the depositing of that material which was once living, to now become part of the geological history of the planet. And what Vernadsky determined is that more than any non-living process that we know of, and you think of all of the non-living processes that cause change on the planet, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tornadoes, hurricanes, different kinds of extreme weather. These are extremely powerful forces. And yet, the existence of life on the planet has had a more powerful, more energetic effect, has actually moved more material through the biosphere than any non-living process that we can document. Life is the most powerful force on the planet. Now, this process, which had always been increasing in intensity over the course of biological time and evolutionary time on Earth, culminated in the appearance of man. And man is a very unique species. We seem to have an animal body, and we surely eat and breathe and have to do all of the things that we have to fulfill, the kinds of material needs that animals also have to fulfill. However, man does something completely unique in the biosphere, which is that man's biogenic migration, the significant impact of man's biogenic migration of materials is not biological. In fact, what we contribute to the change of the planet by what we ingest and leave behind with our bodies is extremely insignificant when you compare us to something like bacteria. However, the impact of the biogenic migration of atoms by technology, or what we'll get to in a moment, the power of the biogenic migration of materials due to the forces of culture, has actually surpassed that which is possible within the biosphere. Man is the most powerful force for changing and shaping the potential power and organization and energy of planet Earth and beyond. Now, how do we do this? Because man's body, as Vernadsky himself notes, man's body has not changed almost at all over the course of its existence. Man's brain even has not changed in its physical structure very much at all over the course of its existence. And yet, if you examine the materials that the human species uses today, what materials we ingest not only into our bodies but into our economies, what materials are present, what processes we shape on the planet, where we are on the planet. If you compare us to 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, what you would say that those snapshots are looking at different biological species. What you would see is the equivalent of different species of the biosphere. And yet, mankind has been a single continuous species over that time. So, how has it been that mankind has accomplished this? So Vernadsky writes a very short writing in 1945 called Some Thoughts About the Noosphere. And the noosphere is the term that he gives to the sphere of human influence and the sphere of the effect of human scientific thought on the change of the planet. And in Some Thoughts About the Noosphere, he poses a question, which is that human scientific thought is not a form of energy. It has no mass. Scientific thought has no measurable energy. How is it that it's caused such tremendous change? So where does this capacity lie? What is the root of this capacity? Vernadsky has a very interesting entry in his journal. He says, "Music seems to me to be the deepest expression of human consciousness. For even in poetry, in science, and in philosophy, where we are operating with logical concepts and words, man involuntarily and always limits and often distorts that which he experiences and understands. Within the bounds of Tuchev's 'a thought once uttered is untrue,' in music we maintain unuttered thoughts. It would be quite interesting to follow in a concrete way the obvious influence of music on scientific thought." Now, if we can get the next slide. He writes in his treatise called Scientific Thought as a Planetary Phenomenon, "During the past 10,000 years, a new form of energy has been created within the realm of living substance, even more intense and complex, and rapidly growing in importance. This new form of energy, associated with the vital activities of human societies, of the genus Homo and other closely related genera, hominids, while preserving the expression of ordinary biogeochemical energy, brings about simultaneously new forms of migration of chemical elements, which in their diversity and power leave the ordinary biogeochemical energy of the living matter of the planet far behind. This new form of biogeochemical energy, which might be called the energy of human culture, or cultural biogeochemical energy, is that form of biogeochemical energy which creates, at the present time, the noosphere." Now, he makes a very interesting observation in the same work, which is that just as in the biosphere, the organisms are not conscious that as a collective whole, including a member of all life which has existed before them, they are contributing to the greatest force of change on the planet. No animal thinks about that. To the animal, he's fulfilling his everyday material needs of survival. That's why he's ingesting the material. That's why he's migrating. That's why he's following the magnetic field lines to migrate to a distant part of the globe, right? The animal doesn't realize that he's part of a large cumulative effect. Well, Vernadsky notes it's been similar with most members of the human species, which is actually pretty incredible when you consider it. Most members of the human species, even when you consider large political developments, historical developments, have not had in their aim the bringing about of the noosphere as a whole, the domination of the planet by cultural biogeochemical energy, the bringing of the geochemistry of the planet to the highest potential that's yet existed. That's not been what's been in the minds of most people or most political leaders, and yet that has been the cumulative effect. So there is a force or a condition outside of any current condition, current state of existence of mankind, toward which mankind as a species is moving. And Vernadsky is very optimistic that for the first time in the 20th century, we can become conscious that this is what we are as a species. Now, those are the views of a scientist, of a physical scientist. What I'd like to do is bring in some observations on the same characteristic of man, but from a different standpoint, which is from the standpoint of the artist. And I'd like to start with this passage, and I'll tell you who the artist is when I finish. He says, "When I examine myself and my methods of thought, I come close to the conclusion that the gift of imagination has meant more to me than any talent for absorbing absolute knowledge. All great achievements of science must start from intuitive knowledge. I believe in intuition and inspiration. At times, I feel certain that I am right while not knowing the reason. Imagination is more important than knowledge." In a different place, he says, "If what is seen and experienced is portrayed in the language of logic, then it is science. If it is communicated through forms whose constructions are not accessible to the conscious mind, but are recognized intuitively, then it is art." And then this third one should probably give away who this person is to you. "The theory of relativity occurred to me by intuition, and music is the driving force behind this intuition. My parents had me study the violin from the time that I was 6. My new discovery is the result of musical perception." So that was Albert Einstein, who is not typically classified as an artist, but who probably would rather classify himself as an artist. Einstein's great friend and colleague, Max Planck, who really established established where we are today in science. His discovery of the quantum, that's still where we are in terms of our scientific platform. And Planck, when he was a young man, had to choose between becoming a physicist and a concert pianist. It's probably good that he chose to be a physicist, but it gives you a sense of who he was. If I could get the next slide. So I'm going to read a couple passages from Planck. They're a little bit long, so I just ask that people really try to follow them, because it gives, I think, very crucial insight from the mind of somebody who made a completely fundamental discovery and also had the kind of connection that Einstein had to the domain of the artistic imagination. So Planck says, this is from a book called Where is Science Going? He wrote, "Throughout its whole composition, the physicist's picture of the external universe must be free from everything in the nature of a logical incoherence. Otherwise, the researcher has an entirely free hand. He may give rein to his own spirit of initiative and allow the constructive powers of the imagination to come into play without let or hindrance. This naturally means that he has a significant measure of freedom in making his mental constructions. But it must be remembered that this freedom is only for the sake of a specific purpose and is a constructive application of the imaginative powers. It is not a mere arbitrary flight into the realms of fancy. The physicist is bound by the very nature of the task in hand to use his imaginative faculties at the very first step he takes. For the first stage of his work must be to take the results furnished by a series of experimental measurements and try to organize these under one law. That is to say, he must select according to a plan which will in the first instance be hypothetical and therefore a construction of the imagination. And when he finds that the given results will not fit into one plan, he discards it and tries another. This means that his imaginative powers must always be speculating on the significance of the data which has been furnished through experimental measurements. And later in the same work, he makes the point in refutation of the reductionists who say that you can know nothing but what you experience. Nothing can be certain except what you experience. And he points out that even taking experimental measurements involves a hypothesis about the nature of what you're dealing with, because a hypothesis had to go into the design of the experimental apparatus in the first place. So it's always the human mind which is on top. Now if we can get the next slide. I really like this one. This is from the same work. He says, "The truth of the whole matter is that the inventor of a hypothesis has unlimited scope in the choice of whatever means he may deem helpful to his ultimate purpose. He is not hindered by the physiological tendencies toward constructive picturing, which are a feature of the activity of his own sense organs. Nor is he restricted by the guiding hand of the physical measuring gear. With the eye of the spirit, he penetrates and supervises the most delicate processes that unfold themselves in the pattern of the physical universe which unrolls before him. He follows the movements of every electron and watches the frequency and form of every wave. He even invents his own geometry as he goes along. And so, with his spiritual working gear, with these instruments of ideal exactitude, he takes a personal part, as it were, in every physical process that happens before him. And all this is for the purpose of pushing through these difficult thought experiments, which are a factor of every research process, to the final establishment of conclusions that will be of wide application." So it's something from the creative, artistic imagination, from the soul of the physical scientist, which some of them we find to be valid and to have wide application to change and control the physical universe. Now, how do we develop this? So what I'd like to do now is zero in on exactly how do we develop this artistic imagination? How do we build a culture, or what is the importance of building a culture in which the artistic imagination and a sense of beauty and goodness dominates the thinking of every member? Not as some beautiful, fantastical, lovely thought, but as something which is absolutely necessary for the future of civilization. So I'd like to bring in some thoughts from somebody who spent probably more time and focus on bringing this to light than anybody that I can think of, which is Friedrich Schiller. And he is somebody who was officially classified as an artist, as a poet, and a dramatist. Now, Schiller lived at a completely tumultuous time for mankind. He was born in, I think it's 1759, and he dies in 1805. And so he lives through the incredible promise of the American Revolution. and the incredible optimism that this sparked across globally over the possibility, the final possibility for the freedom of mankind, the creation of political freedom for the first time. He also lived through the French Revolution, where he saw the first attempt at replicating this incredible victory failed dramatically. And so he takes up in many of his works the discussion of the aesthetical education of the population. And in his work, The Aesthetical Letters, he says of the French Revolution that a great moment had found a little people. Now, Schiller also wrote that, and Mrs. LaRouche referenced it this morning, one of the most powerful tools that an artist or anybody has to transform a people from a state of depravity to a state of morality, to an uplifted, ennobled state, is the stage, is drama, and as we've added into a classical film. And now why? Because on the drama, you can parade before the audience member, you can parade great, beautiful thoughts. You can parade his own follies. You can parade the follies of his time, which he is unwilling to think about in his day-to-day operations. You can parade them before him in a poetical sense and at a distance such that he can reflect on it and pass. And you put him into a state of play in which the ordinary, perhaps usually depraved citizen is able to spend some time passing great moral judgment over the action of kings, which for a time puts him in an uplifted and ennobled state, which hopefully lasts with him when he leaves the theater. In great drama, it does. And Schiller wrote a very short essay called On the Use of Chorus in Tragedy. So we can get the next slide. Oh, here's Schiller. Next slide. He says, art has for its object not merely to afford a transient pleasure, to excite a momentary dream of liberty. Its aim is to make us absolutely free. And this it accomplishes by awakening, exercising, and perfecting in us a power to remove to an objective distance the sensible world, which otherwise only burdens us as rugged matter and presses us down with a brute influence, to transform it into the free working of our spirit, and thus acquire a dominion over the material by means of ideas. For the very reason also that true art requires somewhat of the objective and the real, it is not satisfied with a show of truth. It rears its ideal edifice on truth itself, on the solid and deep foundations of nature. Next slide, please. In the Aesthetical Letters, he writes, ideal art must abandon reality and elevate itself with sufficient boldness above need. For art is the daughter of freedom, and she receives her rules from the necessity of the spirit, not from the pressing need of matter. Thank you. Later in the Aesthetical Letters, he says this. I'll say something about it afterwards. Well, just to set it up, he's confronting the reader with the paradox between the sensuous man, the man of nature, the man of his day-to-day instincts, which is completely shaped by the world, and contrasting that with the man of form, with the never-changing man, which we tend to call the personality, that which persists through all of the successive conditions of the individual. And what he says is that these two aspects of man one cannot affect the other. There's no way for one. They're completely separate spheres. And so it's the task of art to overcome the separation and create an ability for a harmonization of these two conditions of man. And so he says this: the task of culture is to guard over these instincts, and the two separate instincts, and to secure the limits for each. Hence, culture owes an equal justice to both, and defends not only the rational instinct against the sensuous, but also the latter against the former. Therefore, its business is twofold. First, to guard sensuousness against the encroachments of freedom. Second, to guard the personality against the power of sensation. It achieves the first by the education of the power of emotion or sense, the latter by education of the power of reason. And it's for this reason that Schiller says that the artist, before he dare to attempt to move his audience, must, at least in that moment, himself be an ideal individual. He has such a responsibility for the soul of others in his hand that he shouldn't dare to try to move them unless he is sure that he, at least at the moment, is ideal. So I think I'll just, to bring it to a close here, I think I'll just state that these ideas of Schiller, though he lived at a particular time, are universal. These aren't something which are limited to a particular country or a political or a particular cultural thread, but these are ideas of how you move a human species from a condition of beasts and to a condition where he can truly shape the activities of the globe as a unique species of which can access the power of creativity and not live in the now, not live in the moment, but place its identity in what process it can unfold in perpetuity into the future, and to place forever the power of mind above the power of sense. And this morning, Mrs. LaRouche stated that she was not sure that we could save civilization. It does hang by a thread. But I think that we can say that if we do succeed, if we do win this fight today, this will not be a partial victory. This will be a complete victory. And with the potential of cooperation of the United States with the powers of the Pacific and all of the incredibly beautiful classical cultural traditions of these nations, we have the potential today for a renaissance on a global scale, which has never happened before. It was actually, Vernadsky actually stated truly that only in the beginning of the 20th century did mankind gain the power to live anywhere he wanted on the globe. And it was only in the 20th century that we developed powers of communication and technology to communicate and act as a single coordinated species over the globe. But as people probably know from history, it was in the beginning of the 20th century that we had the unleashing of a great century of warfare and collapse. And so I think we should take it on our shoulders as our legacy to make these first moves for what will be mankind's first perpetual, unending global renaissance. So I'll just end by reading the very last paragraph of the paper by Mr. LaRouche that I began with, A Search for a Mislaid Truth. So if we can get the last slide. So Mr. LaRouche says, there is one particular concern to be examined on such accounts: the underlying role of truly classical artistic composition, its true mystery, and its performance, and its importance as a medium of subtleties freed from what passes for the implicit beat of the inherent state of those acts of lurking drunkenness of what is marked as merely popular entertainments. For that purpose, classical artistic composition and its performance must carry our very souls as if into a greater universe, beyond any ordinary apprehension, of the which we must experience as the higher reality enveloping our innermost experience of a truly classical intention, an actual apprehension of immortality.